Michael Brooks Show. We're here, we're live. We're still in quarantine in our virtual worlds, but we're still holding it down as always with super producer Matt Leck, chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
On this week's program, Abby Martin. She's host of the Empire Files, an incredible, intrepid journalist. And we are going to be talking about how the Trump administration is taking this moment to escalate its empire activities across the globe. Sanctions killing innocents in Iran, a bounty put on the president of Venezuela, and also an incredible act of South-South cooperation with Cuban doctors that we'll get to as well. And then Liz Francic of TrueAnon, she joins us. We're talking about sympathy for the conspiracy mind. Why was the CIA so into French postmodernism and why it's not good? Shout out to Whole Foods strikes. Boycott Amazon. Stand in solidarity. Amazon firing a worker attempting to organize an Amazon warehouse. We're talking about COVID capitalism with David Griscom. In the post game, we've got a great debunk, as always, with Ben Burgess. A new segment, Illicit Histories of Vinyl with Joshua Kahn Russell. Also, stop simping for Andrew Cuomo. Start simping for Pepe Mujica. All that and much, much more on the Michael Brooks Show. Before we keep it moving, as always, how are you guys doing? It's getting really bad here in New York. That isn't all media hype. How are you guys?
Getting by. Spending a lot of time cooking. Very lucky. I've spent years, sort of mastering good Southern food. So making a lot of cornbread and beans and getting by.
Nice. I'll see you later for it.
Yeah, it's funny.
I'll break quarantine to get that food.
It's funny how much like food seems to be like routines around food, basically. Like oatmeal now. I'm making some burgers every couple of days. And like making tea, which is strange. I feel like I'm back in London.
Tea.
Yeah, exactly. Like tea's become mainly because of my girlfriend. So like I don't know. I'm holding up, thankful, at least so far. And I think we have some scary days ahead. So just kind of bracing for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Word. All right, folks. Well, let's talk about the blame game and the geostrategic fallout of this all. Just yesterday or the day before, Hungary under Viktor Orban has essentially officially ended democracy in Hungary. Emergency powers were passed through parliament, suspending elections, calling for years-long prison sentences for spreading quote-unquote fake news, a curfew, and other measures, essentially functionally making Viktor Orban a dictator. Bill Barr, the head of the DOJ, has put forward a terrifying request to Congress, allowing judges to hold people indefinitely without trial because of quote-unquote emergency situations. We'll talk about that more later. And the question that I have for all of you is this all China's fault? Now, if you might be forgiven for saying yes, because here are some headlines that you would have seen in the past couple of months about China. How the coronaviruses revealed authoritarianism's fatal flaw. How Russia is using authoritarian tech to curb the coronavirus. Of course, Russia is always a big target in the United States. And dictatorships are making the outbreak worse. Now, has any of the recent moves in the West, including an adoption of policies that seem to be sensible in this moment, like quarantines that were initially sort of Sinoized as being kind of part of Asia's intrinsic repression and now are universally accepted? Have we rethought that? Or have we said, wow, there is an authoritarian tendency here that's manifesting globally. Maybe we should critique that? No, of course not. The Washington Post, the New York Times, Vox, and so on have continued with brutal attacks on the Chinese government, especially, and the Russian government as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with criticizing any government. And I actually think a really smart and interesting conversation about China is still yet to be had, one that balances the positives, negatives, and just changing global reality, which we'll get to in a minute. But what do we always see in the United States? A outsourcing, an external blame when America's absolutely grotesque imperial rot is revealed every second. Every time an ambulance goes by in New York, and I think about a preventable death that can be laid at the feet of our capitalism, our corporations, Donald Trump, Andrew Cuomo, and Bill de Blasio, I get absolutely disgusted and enraged, and I don't think of ways to blame China. Now, obviously, China sees incredible opportunity in this because the United States and the Europeans are failing. Of course, most spectacularly, the United States. China has, after some significant initial mistakes out of the gate, actually objectively done an incredible job in containing the virus. They are making enormous strides and gains. New reports talking about supposedly underreporting numbers seem to me more likely the effort of kind of countering China's success than any real systemic critique or flaws or new reporting. Now, China, of course, is going to pursue its own foreign policy as anybody else would in this moment. It's sending equipment and doctors and ventilators to Italy, to Serbia, to Hungary, and of course, also in Latin America and the Middle East. The Western alliance system is freaking out and whining because your leaders like the countries like the Serbians are taking China's help instead of course, looking as an example at EU directives that have called for governments inside the European Union to cut health spending literally hundreds of times. And of course, the United States, with its absolutely unparalleled record of obscene inequality and no social safety net, is what is exposing the weaknesses of the Western system and the enormous and obvious opportunities for China. For years now, the liberal mindset and the foreign policy apparatus of the United States has attempted to blame all social and economic ills on Russia and China. Now we have a never-ending grotesque administration whose greed and capitalist double-dealing knows absolutely no bounds. And even as people decry that administration and the death toll rises, they are still looking to blame China. Here's Mike Pompeo, the grotesque Secretary of State, talking about the United States having unique sympathy and care in the world, even as the United States continues to implement punishing grotesque sanctions around the world, and China daily wins a PR battle by sending needed equipment across the world.
The United States understands this is a humanitarian challenge, a humanitarian crisis, and we are deeply committed.
Needs to go up a little bit.
Gets to the people of those countries. We care more often.
Excuse me, sorry.
All right, we'll just redo it and play it. This is Mike Pompeo.
Okay. It should be sharing sound. I'll just turn it up.
Yeah, just turn up a bit.
A humanitarian challenge, a humanitarian crisis, and we are deeply committed to ensuring that humanitarian assistance gets to the people of those countries. We care more often about the people in those countries than their own leaders do. That's sad. That's a reflection of those regimes too often. It's the reason, in fact, that we're working to help those people raise up in their country so that they can get a better outcome for themselves. I have to reiterate, the goods that are needed for each of these countries to resolve the coronavirus problem in their nations are not sanctioned. They were not sanctioned, they are not sanctioned, and they will not be sanctioned. Indeed, the United States has gone beyond that. It's not just that they're not sanctioned. It's not simply that they're prohibited. The United States, the American people, are working diligently in each of these countries that you're thinking of as sanctioned nations to try and assist getting humanitarian assistance into those countries, not only from the United States, but to help other countries deliver that humanitarian assistance to the people of those nations. This policy is deeply consistent with the finest traditions of the United States of America.
That's, of course, totally dishonest, and Mike Pompeo is sort of like a perfect embodiment of the just absolute grotesque rot. Even if you don't specifically sanction medical goods, as an example, if you make financial transactions impossible for the Iranians and basic import exports, that will apply to medical needs, as it already has. In fact, you saw in Iran, even before the outbreak of the pandemic, folks dying because of lack of access to cancer medication. Meanwhile, China, as I say, has built its own distinct narrative. You can like it or not, but China is going to have an alternative explanation of the world as to where the virus has come from, and it is aggressively and successfully advocating for itself and putting forward help across the world, including in key U.S. and strategic allies like Italy, where the Chinese and, of course, the noble Cuban doctors have done much more than the United States. I'll quote briefly from Ajit Singh now. China, led by its robust state institutions, have contained the virus with decisive measures and have emerged as a global leader in providing medical aid and expertise in countries around the world. Meanwhile, having squandered months to prepare, bought by China's disciplined approach, the U.S. government's response to the pandemic has been wholly inadequate. Relying on the whims of the private sector, the quote-unquote free market, the U.S. is now suffering from the worst corona outbreak in the world, with infections per capita 6 times greater than China. Now, again, should this lead to a romantic narrative about China as an alternative? No, we need to look at all realities. But the fundamental reality and truth of this situation is that China is infinitely outperforming the United States and speeding up a process of global realignment that was already going to happen, probably several years forward, thinking 2020 instead of 2030. The world is looking to China for relief, and the U.S. Has only been able to push itself into greater embarrassment and isolation. With the crisis ongoing and the structural weakness and inability of the U.S. system to provide even basic medical and essential services for itself, the global viewpoint will turn increasingly to China across every corner of the world and will correlate with China's Belt and Road initiatives that will link Africa through Central Asia to Southern Europe. The core of the United States is an absolute rot. It's a disgusting system headed by disgusting and feckless people, causing massive unnecessary death. There's no doubt that there's elements of the American tradition that need to be retrieved and defended, just like every single tradition in the world has elements that need to be retrieved and defended. But there's no use in denying the absolute rot of America as it is now, and what is causing not only the great humanitarian devastation of the states, but also speeding up a process of global change that was already underway. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I would just add that it's very obvious to anyone who's paying attention that China is completely outmaneuvering the United States. Our response has been a great example of just the fact that this empire is very much in decline. And the kind of whining that we're seeing, the kind of like jingoistic whining that we're seeing from people in magazines like Foreign Policy, and basically complaining that China providing medical aid to Italians or Serbians or to the Netherlands is all propaganda. It's like, yes, well, obviously they're doing that to pursue their own interests, but they're also providing necessary medical materials to people.
The answer to that is do your own propaganda.
Yeah, doing good things. Doing good things has propaganda value.
Yeah. It's the same thing with Cuba, though, too, right? It's like Cuba is like, oh, Cuba uses their doctors for propaganda. It's like, well, if their propaganda is showing that they're good people and they help people in times of crisis, then at a certain point, like, when does it start being propaganda and start being reality? So I don't know. I mean, I just think that after we see what's just going on economically in the West, China is very much like well positioned to have accelerated the kind of economic conflict between the United States and China that has been, sort of in the cards for a long time, and it looks like they might win it.
I didn't actually retain anything from it. I can't remember the Post-American World by what's his name? The CNN guy, Fareed Zakaria. I remember this like from my era of when you subscribed to The Economist because you thought it would help you be smart.
Right.
But like it's pretty, I think, surreal to look back at like what that actually looks like as opposed to what all the theories were. Anyway, it's
Do you
happening
remember
fast.
what you said to me when you first you said I subscribe to The Economist because I'm smart?
Yeah. Oh, the smart, me and my smart friends
Yeah.
discussing The Economist.
I read the Free Zakaria because I'm smart.
Did you guys?
Look, I think it's a really there was a piece in the Financial Times I tweeted out the other day about China's building essentially an alternative to the internet, an alternative internet. And again, again, in terms of objective reality, shows like this would not do well in that model of the internet, right? So again, I can't substitute one romantic narrative with another, but
Yeah.
it's very important to both then take it to the United States. Platform capitalism, Silicon Valley, built in partnership with the U.S. intelligence services and military industrial complex, has created an internet here that is more open in some respects, but profoundly undemocratic and monopolized.
Mm-hmm.
So what is there a possibility of a third way for an internet that does not exist? And then the other part is the reality of, there's very little alternative in the world right now, right? And China is objectively performing better. So that's the other just sort of major takeaway. Like being able to assemble and build this many hospitals, contain an outbreak, get praised by the WHO, and then effectively nation brand by putting stuff across the world, that's a win. And the constant whining about it just doesn't achieve anything, even if you were concerned about the balance of power and this and that. It just makes you look totally ineffective and embarrassing.
And I just wanted to add something that came to my head is an interview with Yanis Varoufakis, and this was probably from a couple of years ago. But somebody basically asked him about the rise of China and whether or not that's like a great threat to global stability. And he told a story that was really interesting about him negotiating with the European Union. Remember when he was the finance minister of Greece? He was going on this horrible fighting against all this terrible austerity, and basically being told by the European Union, this doesn't make sense, but we're going to do it anyway.
Yep.
Versus negotiating with the Chinese. And he said, the Chinese are very smart investors and they are playing for the long game. They understand. You look at the loans that they're giving out to people, they're giving them at very low rates. They understand that like the world needs massive investment, both through capital and also through manpower, and they're providing it in a way that the United States can come up with all these stories about why the Chinese competition is somehow wrong. And they've come up with a million different reasons for it. But the fact is that China's showing up to a world that massively needs a kind of stimulus. And hopefully that would come from a source that doesn't have the issues that we have in China. And it's not a kind of blind praising of that system, but it's a recognition that the United States is very much an empire in decline and cannot get anything other than short-term goals outside of their head, while the Chinese are very happy to play a decades-long game.
That's also another thing that's interesting when you dip into more China studies, like in contrast to these very one-dimensional narratives. And again, I'll keep reiterating, of course there's repression. Of course, like we can't deny things that are true. And at the same time, people who work in partnership with China is like around things like Belt and Road will always strongly emphasize how much more flexible China is to work with on those types of projects in terms of like adaptability and responding to local circumstances versus the kind of U.S. one size fits all model. All right, we're going to just talk a little bit about this as well. This finally got some. Oh, sorry guys, I don't know what just happened. Oh, I don't know what just happened there. Sorry, we're under attack from this is finally getting some coverage in the in the corporate media. A little over a week ago, and I don't know the status of this now, some outlets, Vox, Politico, reported that Bill Barr's DOJ was requesting emergency powers for judges, that essentially in a time of emergency, you could hold people indefinitely in terms of pretrial, and it would also do a number of other really disturbing things. I want to play a few seconds here. This is Ari Melber with Maya Wiley, and she'll kind of outline this here. This is something really important to keep an eye on and talk to Congresspeople about.
Why it is such.
Sorry, let me turn the volume up.
Drafted, and part of why it is such a shocking attempt at a power grab is it's not just limited to this particular pandemic or moment in time. What the letter asks for was any disaster, any emergency. What's an emergency? Who defines that? And what would be essentially blocked would be any person who is arrested, not just whether you've already been convicted, but you've just been arrested and you might not be brought before a judge for who knows how long under the way it's framed. It's simply astounding.
What does it reveal to you that of all the things that could be done right now, the government's playing catch up, this was something that Bill Barr apparently rushed out?
Right. We can, so again, I just want people to be very, very aware of this. We went in depth with Shahid Buttar, but there is a huge push here to keep rolling back what little liberties, really kind of remain in a substantive sense. And obviously we put them in the through line of things like the Patriot Act and NSA surveillance and so on. And this is going to correlate with the capacity of people to strike, the capacity of people to organize, because ultimately this stuff is about making politics so constricted that you don't have room to operate. And this has been, there's a lot of elements behind this. We also should look at the surveillance and aggressive spying that goes on of the ecological movement. And this is also a good point, I think, for the left in this context to recognize that for all of the flaws and hypocrisies and blah, 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 there's important ground in constitutional protections from which to work around like actual political projects that cannot be forgotten. So this is really dangerous and folks need to really keep attentive to it. And also, I would run it parallel with what they've done in Hungary as a very natural fulfillment of where these right-wing authoritarian projects are trying to go. All right, let's get to the shout out.
Well, I don't know if we have a drop here.
We don't have a drop. I think it's all right. We can just get to it. So workers are, can we put up that piece about the whole food strikes? Basically, look, people are starting to go on strike across the country, and we're just going to keep hammering this. There's limits to these things, obviously. There's big strategic questions we have to ask about the efficacy of strikes in the, and as an example, the sort of age of government bailouts and unending sort of government credit and money for the corporate sector that people have pointed out. And at the same time, these are the first and most essential steps. And these kind of discrete movements and actions, whether they be rent strikes or work strikes, we need to start talking about how to synchronize them and bring them together. I'll read a little bit from Vice. As we address, and this is quoting now from Vice, go up to the top. Can you just, Whole Foods employees are planning a strike on Tuesday to protest the lack of protections offered to working during the coronavirus pandemic, the first national collective action led by workers at the company since it was founded in 1980. On March 31st, Whole Food employees will call in sick and demand paid, scroll down, leave for all workers who stay home or self-quarantine during the crisis, free coronavirus testing for all employees, hazard pay for the double the current hourly wage for employees who show up during the pandemic, and that's really important. What's taking place here with the Whole Foods strikes. Now, in addition to that, there was somebody who got fired for trying to organize an. Who was that name?
Chris Smalls.
And can you talk about that for a second?
I mean, he was organizing a wildcat strike, I believe, in Staten Island, at their facility here in Staten Island, and they let him go, and they cited, New York is a at will employer state, but they cited that he was putting his coworkers in danger. And, we should just, take a second to laugh at the irony of the fact that Amazon, which has basically shown very little to no concern for the safety of their workers during this pandemic. This is somebody who's actually just basically trying to get the bare minimum kind of protections for people and sick leave and hazard pay. And they let him go for a bunch of BS reasons. And we shouldn't let them get away with that.
All right. So absolutely. So we're going to keep talking about that and trying to think of how to fit these things together. Let's do a little pitch. And then actually, can you get Abby in 5 minutes? I'm going to just take a 1 minute break before we go to Abby. But first, let's do the pitch. Guys, please, first and foremost, if you need a deal, let us know. Obviously people are quitting because of economic conditions. Other people are joining. And if you have the opportunity to join, definitely join now at patreon.com/TMBS so we can keep everything going strong. There's a massive amount of extra content to give you. And we're really, really excited about it and honored about it. Tomorrow, starting on April 1st, of course, is the new month. Let us know if you want to stay on, but you need a deal. We're helping you out. So just get to us on that, patreon.com/TMBS. You should also go to Red Emma's to get a pre-order of my book, Against the Web, the Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right. And there's a new review by Matthew McGinnis, which I tweeted out earlier that people can check out. All right, let's get to Abby in a minute, and I'm going to be right back, guys. I'm just going to run just for 1 second.
All right.
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is the great Abby Martin. She's host of Empire Files. Abby, how you doing?
Hey.
How are you doing? For real, what's going on?
I've been better. I think it comes in waves. It depends on the day to day of the news and all of that. I mean, I'm trying to not obsessively watch corporate media, so I'm just kind of looking at alternative news online and checking out people that make me think about things critically while also getting the necessary information, because I just can't stand the just incessant death and fear mongering from CNN, MSNBC. It's just too much to take.
Yeah, I'm not watching any of that. That's a good question. How do we balance not building some kind of alternative reality? This is a real thing. This is a threat. This is something to be super cautious and careful about. And then if you're just totally subsumed in the panic, you're not going to ask other types of questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, that's why I appreciated you showing that clip about Trump, potentially the widespread abuse that can happen with these sort of unprecedented powers that will be granted. And a lot of people, fear is a powerful drug, and a lot of people are terrified, and they're just going to look to Trump, even though he's been horrible on this, to just say, look, do whatever you can. And that could include potentially Patriot Act type scenarios that we're going to see just put indefinitely in place, which scares me. Also, I don't rule out potentially suspending the election on his behalf. So it could get really ugly.
Yeah, totally. And then we need to be constructive about it, even as we're quarantined. So I don't know. Somebody was saying we need to start saying that we're physically distancing, but not socially distancing, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. It's just weird because he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth, as he always does, where it's kill grandma and grandpa and kill your parents to worship the market and open the economy. But then in the same way, all these kind of backdoor measures are being taken to do what we just talked about. So these kind of draconian measures to give, the DOJ's pushing for indefinite detention and all of this stuff. So it's scary to think that there's other people in the security team that are making moves for something that could escalate. Meanwhile, Trump is just, talking out of his ass as usual.
And doing a great job.
Absolutely. Drink more aquarium fertilizer or whatever the hell.
Here's the guy from some mattress clearing store. Talk about how I'm crushing it. So we've got to talk. We're going to actually end on playing some sound at the end that will be positive. So don't worry. But guys, the empire is in full force. Domestically, we see the rot here. And we also see the enormous threats in terms of freedom and civil liberties and the capacity to organize, right?
Mm-hmm.
But let's start with Venezuela. The idea of putting a $15 million bounty, essentially, on Maduro's head, Nicolas Maduro's head. For people who don't know, the Southern District of New York has put literally a $15 million warrant on Maduro, essentially treating him as the head of a drug cartel. Lawfare was already a thing used aggressively in Latin America under the Obama administration to criminalize and target leaders like Lula, obviously. This is like a crazy aggressive escalation of that same tactic.
Absolutely. I think that it's important to really keep in mind, since you brought up Obama, that this kind of campaign of sanctions began under Obama. Back in 2015, I think he declared Venezuela a unique national security threat, just completely out of the blue. It was very random, made no sense at all. And so that really started the wave of sanctions that we've seen accelerate the hyperinflation, put the Venezuelan economy into complete free fall once Trump got in. I think 2017 was this maximum pressure campaign that was launched. And really, it's prevented any sort of recovery economically. I mean, any sort of curb on the hyperinflation. And people really need to understand, when we're talking about the economic war in Venezuela, it's primarily due to U.S. sanctions. So let's talk really quickly about what Maduro's doing now, and then how it kind of comes, this bounty is coming on the heels of this really pro-worker movement that he's putting into place to deal with the pandemic in his country. Sanctions had already killed 40,000 people in the country since 2017. And that is verified. That is excess deaths counted by the Center for Economic and Policy Research in DC. But his working class approach to the pandemic, I think, has been really monumental. Obviously puts the US empires to shame. I mean, I think every country in the world at this point is putting the US empire to shame of what they're doing at home. But we're talking about 6-month rent freezes, moratorium layoffs, absolving of, small and middle businesses wages completely. And in order to do this huge measure, he needs money. He needs direct cash injections into the economy. And the US is directly blocking any sort of IMF emergency loans, any sort of international access to these bank accounts that he has been prevented from getting, especially under the false shadow government of Juan Guaido, the CIA puppet that was incubated in DC, that's still pretending like he's running the show and recognized by all these countries. So all of this happened, already. The pandemic was already in place in Venezuela. There was already several cases, and that's when we saw this bounty being declared. It's essentially a kidnapping bounty. As you mentioned, $15 million on the head of Maduro. I mean, there's so much to say about this, and it really is absolutely insane. I mean, on one hand, it puts extraordinary pressure on the Maduro government. He's already dealing with so much to deal with the pandemic in the country, already deal with the economic war, already deal with the subsidized CLAP food distribution program, which still needs to happen, right, to get 7 million people food subsidies every month. And now he has to worry about an enormous security detail, because essentially this is telling anyone in the country, including, of course, the opposition, who has a wet dream of this coup from within, that there's an enormous reward if you can lead to the arrest. And I'm not putting aside the potential assassination attempt again, as we've seen play out before against Maduro. And look, what happened to Manuel Noriega. I mean, this is something that the U.S. has done before, actually as a precursor to invade Panama in 1989, and they killed 3,000 Panamanians.
Right.
So, I mean, did you know about how insane it was that it backfired, though? And this shows you how stupid the Trump administration is, though, because I just read this today. Because this is like on a dozen or so government officials as well, these bounties, like $10 million bounties, not just on Maduro, but these other officials. And one of them, I wanted to read really quickly from Common Dreams. One of them is a retired General Alcala, who's listed in the indictments. He's a former ally of Hugo Chavez, turned opposition in 2015. He's been linked to various coup plots and planned terror attacks since 2016, and he's now like a high-profile former officer that's part of Juan Guaido's security detail. He was just found. Yeah, so it's like, dude, now it's given actually the Venezuelan government incentive to put like a warrant on this guy's head and say, okay, yeah, we want him too. He was just found with a weapons cache, $500,000 in Colombia that he admitted was directed by Juan Guaido with Juan Guaido's quote unquote money, AKA the tens of millions of dollars provided to him by the USAID to just pay for his shadow government to exist. So this completely backfired in the sense that they charged a guy who was a Juan Guaido guy. So now Juan Guaido is being open for investigation for this coup/assassination attempt. It's just unbelievable, the incompetence of this administration. But it's still just really scary because there's so many people who could take action on this. And I'm not putting anything past what the US can do there.
Yeah, of course. Can you talk a little bit more about the Panama history? I think that's important for people to understand. Obviously, Noriega was not in any type of Chavista tradition. He was a very right-wing, he was a primary CIA client. But there is similarities in this scenario.
Sure. I mean, people should check out, I forget the documentary name, but there's a really great documentary about the Panamanian invasion. And it's just interesting that, the world changed after 9/11, 3,000 Americans died, and now we're in this perpetual global war on terror. And the vast majority of Americans have no idea about the US invading Panama, killing at least 3,000 Panamanians. They're still finding mass graves to this day. It's absolutely despicable. This is just one of many crimes from the U.S. empire and its sordid history. But yeah, I mean, Manuel Noriega was a long-standing U.S. ally, drug trafficker, quote unquote. He was charged in, I think, some Florida court for narco trafficking. And this was all stuff that he said was with open collaboration and knowledge of the U.S. All of the things that he was doing was when he was a useful ally, right? Just like Saddam Hussein. I mean, his usefulness expired. And that's when the bounty was placed on his head. I think at that point in 1989, it was a $1 million bounty. And it's just unbelievable that that was actually used to invade a country, to invade this country and just wantonly kill civilians. And then they arrested Noriega, put him in jail. And I mean, it's just disgusting, Michael, because the whole narco trafficking scheme has been this long-standing debunked U.S. policy that's levied against leftist leaders, not Noriega necessarily, but Maduro specifically. And it's completely debunked. It's even been debunked that Venezuela is some sort of narco trafficking regime by like right-wing think tanks in DC. Like pro-opposition think tanks have debunked this. And we all know that Colombia, the military outpost of the U.S. empire, is the narco trafficking regime. Uribe was listed as like just from U.S. officials, the former president who's now closely allied with Ivan Duque, the current president, as like narco traffickers. This is absolutely documented. I was on the front lines of the drug war in Colombia. I've documented this extensively for Empire Files. That's why it's so audacious and absurd to actually claim that Venezuela is the one who's the narco trafficking regime when the U.S.'s greatest ally that produces the world's most cocaine and the U.S. consumes the world's most cocaine is Colombia.
Right. So, and also the difference, I think, between the other layer of this, which is like just getting real about, like, I think that there's not a government in the world in which you couldn't have valid criticisms of, but the real conversation actually to me, particularly with Venezuela, starts to become, okay, if there have been deals made with facets of the military or whatever else, well, right, because how have they survived? Like the governments in Latin America that have played by rules in a much friendlier way have been destroyed by the United States and capital interests in their own countries. So even if you're on like some type of liberal kick of being preoccupied with like the challenges that these governments face, you still have to look at the pressure from outside that is creating that context.
Absolutely. And that's the context that we never see or hear about, right? It's always kind of, and there's like this third way that really doesn't exist. I mean, you go to Venezuela and the opposition who's not part of this Juan Guaido cult will tell you, like, we don't want the US involved. Like,
Right.
let us do what we want to try to, have some sort of democratic measures to advance our agenda. So I think the vast majority of Venezuelans can all unanimously agree. And this is the same thing in Cuba when I was there just doing man on the streets. A lot of people had a lot of criticisms for the government, but the one universal thing, the message to Americans was, please stop these criminal sanctions. We can't get medicine.
Right.
And, all these think pieces from all the kind of neoliberal establishment blob from across the political spectrum just bemoans whether it's Iranian incompetence or China's belligerence and the Communist Party's failures and stuff. It's just like no one ever talks about what the US's role is in terms of criminal sanctions upending economically, especially in Cuba and Venezuela. So it's tiresome. It's tiresome because it's not honest.
Yeah, it's totally dishonest, and it's babyish and delusional, and it's also like, I don't know, like, just have the capacity to think outside of yourself for 30 seconds. And anybody would be pissed off by the idea of a bohemian, like just another country harassing you and bothering you and setting the template for your policy. And you see this, I know, obviously, and I've had conversations about, Gaza. It's like, yeah, I'm sure, like, listening to people like, well, Gaza doesn't have like pride parades. It's like, well, okay. I mean, first of all, maybe they would, in like a trajectory that wasn't like filled with death and destruction every day by Israel. But like, what an incredible, dilute. And I think, and I just want to actually make this specific because I was talking about China earlier. And China's more complicated, but what's interesting to me about the China case is, like, we can point out the hypocrisy and the bullshit of the conversations about Latin America or the Middle East or whatever. And that's all true. And that's very important for us as Americans to do. But in China, it starts to become different because they're a peer competitor and they can just be like, so, like, who gives a fuck what you think? And that is really making people in like the DC world lose their heads, because there's no like respect to it that people have to like kind of pretend that they have, right?
Oh yeah, this whole pandemic is just opening golden opportunities for all these neocons and establishment figures that have just salivated over the potential war with China, because we know that's an inevitability. As you said, it's a huge economic competitor, and all of this anti-China rhetoric kind of ramping up, it translates into policy, and it will translate into policy. And that's, whether that's stalling supply chains of essential pharmaceuticals and medical supplies, it's outrageous. Meanwhile, you have Senator Tom Cotton out there just saying the craziest shit I've ever heard. And he was saying it before Chinese officials were pontificating whether or not this was like a US bioweapon. Tom Cotton was out there on the news just talking about this all the time. So,
right.
All this shit is part of an information war that's going to translate into real policy that is scary, because it's putting us in a new Cold War with China. And it's a dangerous time because we need global cooperation and international solidarity right now.
Let's talk about Iran for a few minutes. That is one of the most brutal points of this economic war. There's been some moves. Bernie Sanders has signed a letter with AOC and some other people about lifting them. The reporting is that Mike Pompeo actually sees this as a great opportunity. And I want you to take it like everything else. Like, people not getting testing kits in the United States is not that's not like, oh, that's so fucked up, I can't believe that would happen. That's exactly what would happen here because of how we design our economy. And Mike Pompeo seeing an almost genocidal policy against Iran as an opportunity, that's our Iran policy.
Well, we know how much Mike Pompeo loves the apocalypse. So he has an apocalyptic worldview when it comes to other countries. And he, as well as other crazy ass people in the Trump administration, are seeing this global pandemic and disregarding the need that we all need to cooperate together. And mind you, like, Iran even just like with the interests of the US to curb this globally, like you would think that they would just limit sanctions just because like, okay, well, if people in Iran have it, like they're inevitably going to spread it to other countries, but like they can't, they're so short-sighted. And I think this really reveals the hand of the empire. It exposes what the true intent of sanctions are. This is an imperialist's dream. They just are hoping for something like this to happen in a country that they're asphyxiating economically, because once something like this happens, massive amounts of people will die and suffer completely unnecessarily. And then we can just look at them and blame the regime, right? Blame the regime for the growing pile of bodies and just say, well, look, this is what you get. This is what you get when you don't capitulate to our interests. It's cynical. It's Nazi-esque, to be honest. And the thing is, already on top of Trump's 800 or so sanctions that he's added, and mind you, this is like 700 more than any other president has ever put on Iran. Trump has just ramped them up to just unseen levels. But on top of that, they're adding more. They're adding more to politicians who are resisting U.S. troop presence in Iraq to punish them, adding more to charities in Iran that are trying to protect holy sites, and then, of course, more on Iran's oil sector, because like Venezuela, Iran survives primarily on oil exports. It's absolutely insane, but that's not all they're doing. And as we know, Iran, of course, is the epicenter of the crisis in the Middle East. But it's interesting that the U.S. has already surpassed the death toll. What are we at? Like 3,000 or something now. I think Iran is not at 3,000 yet. So despite the quote unquote incompetence of the regime and the big cover up there and all of this, the U.S. is still taking the cake, right? The U.S. exceptionalism at its best. But that's not all. I was actually surprised to learn that the U.S. is taking other very aggressive measures militarily to threaten Iran during this time, not only the bombing of so-called Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, and using this, to curb, quote, Iranian influence in the region, but they're also sending ships to the Arabian Sea in a clear threat to Iran, and also doing like mock exercises with the United Arab Emirates, setting up a fake Iranian city. I think it's called Native Fury, this mock exercise. You can check it out on YouTube. It's very surreal and dystopian that this is what we're spending our time and energy doing. Meanwhile, you have, other imperialist surrogates like France who are withdrawing troops from Iraq right now to deal with their own threat of corona in their country. And the US is just using this entire pandemic as an opportunity to advance. And it is quite shocking how much death is being carried out around the world. This doesn't just stop and start with Iran and Venezuela right now, Michael. I mean, it goes on to Yemen, where the U.S. Saudi coalition just bombed the shit out of Yemen, and it just goes on and on and on. It's really unbelievable. But I mean, this is what the U.S. empire does.
In what way? Just because I like that you're very clear about Trump's position in this, because people need to think clearly about that, not in terms of like the usual melodrama about Trump that liberals have, which is ahistorical and totally politically ineffective, but also not taking Trump at face value. Like this notion that I think this is getting pretty thoroughly debunked at this point, but this is not a secret isolationist or anything else. This isn't somebody who has because of this weird, like, right-wing anti-imperialism, which we should be skeptical of anyways, obviously. What is his actual role here? Because it seems to me like it's totally the logic of empire.
It's a really important point, and for some odd reason, there's not enough people talking about it. I think we understand the bipartisan foreign policy consensus in Washington. We know that they want to advance, they agree with a lot of what Trump's doing, and that's the problem, right? When you don't have the Democratic establishment challenging him on things because they're complicit essentially in the wide view of where we're going with China, with Iran, with Latin America. But it's also just kind of sad that a lot of the alternative media has lost sight of what Trump is doing and taken his words at face value. Like if he tweets the phrase "end endless wars," people are like, see, they want to impeach him because he's anti-war. It's just like, what are you talking about? Like, do you not realize what he's been doing? I mean, the Iranian thing alone, not only did he appoint anti-Iran hawks, primarily John Bolton. I mean, let's face it, this is a guy who has written op-eds calling for a war with Iran for the last decade, appointing him so closely to him. And then when he fired him saying because he didn't want to go far enough, I think let's take his words at face value then. I mean, the fact that Trump has added so many sanctions alone, like the 700 or 800 sanctions that Trump added, the abolishment of the nuclear deal, the fact that he was tweeting the bombs that they would drop would equal the amount of hostages that Iran took in 1979. I mean, this is just unbelievably insane Orwellian shit that we're dealing with, that Trump is boasting about, and also talking about the hostage crisis as if it's like a personally offensive to him, that he wants to vindicate, and pursue policy based on that. There's so many instances that Trump has taken with Iran that are just clearly his own executive power. I mean, that he, and also the people that he's appointed around him, I think that we should understand that he appointed these people. It's not the neocons running him. It's not Trump opposing them from within or opposing the deep state. He literally picked the most anti-Iran, anti-China, anti-communist hawks that he possibly could find in the entire DC foreign policy establishment to surround him and comprise of his cabinet. So I don't know why people give him a pass, but unfortunately, whether it be drone strikes around the world, civilian casualties, or whatnot, Trump has escalated and ramped up U.S. militarism everywhere. And these coup attempts, I mean, now the coup attempt again, the regenerated coup attempt in Venezuela is very, very scary. The abolishment of the normalization with Cuba. He just bombed Somalia 2 weeks ago. All of these things Trump signs off on. And you mentioned Palestine. I mean, that's a whole other issue of just unprecedented levels of this medieval siege that Trump has signed off on is just absolutely devastating. And we have to keep our brothers and sisters in mind there who are without ventilators and electricity.
Absolutely. And, Bolton as an example, or Pompeo, I mean, these guys are really, 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 really ugly. So we can't even give Trump the out of, he was just looking for somebody who would look good on TV with him. So even worse, it's like, look, this guy is like, there's a jawline. Okay. Maybe it has nothing to do with policy, but he's so committed to empire, he will be flanked by people who look like absolute shit. I think that's something really to consider. Abby, I want to play this for you. And David, maybe you could get your screen going, because just you talked about the need for international solidarity before. And I absolutely. And I want to play something, I think, on a political level. There's been a huge amount of amazing things from obviously first responder teams and people in medicine and people who work, in as grocers and so on, and people striking and people helping their neighbors out, no doubt. But the political terrain in general has just been disgusting and depressing mostly. This was the most kind of moving thing I've seen. And this is the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who Ralph Gonzalez, I'm not sure I pronounced his last name correctly. I want to just say in general, he, along with Mia Motley in Barbados, and also the leader of Dominica, whose name I'm forgetting right now, these are very brave leaders. Like, these are people, as an example, have resisted what the United States is attempting to do in Venezuela. And we're talking about places with, obviously they've got international reach and they have a lot of appealing, resources, and are dynamic countries, but they don't have they have very little geopolitical power to do that from. And it's a lot of courage. And this is video of Prime Minister Gonzalez, or as they call him, and his Twitter name you could see is @Comrade Ralph, which is funny, welcoming a delegation of Cuban doctors to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Of course, we've talked about the incredible heroism of the Cuban doctors and the role they're playing in Italy and across the world. And he welcomes them to the airport in St. Vincent in the Grenadines, and kind of talks about the history behind it. And I just want to play this and then get your thoughts, Abby. I thought this was pretty moving.
Solidarity. Entirely by South-South cooperation. It's the only airport in the English-speaking Caribbean without the imprimatur of North America or Europe. It's a special case. the historic struggles took place here in the 19th century against British colonialism. And now you come to assist us with a big threat. So far we have one confirmed case. And we are containing and managing with our own resources. But we are looking forward to your help and your expertise and your professionalism. St. Vincent and Grenadines is not new to Cuban medical personnel, nurses and doctors. We have many of them here.
So it's a little difficult with the jet engine, but I mean, I think you probably heard that. Hopefully everybody watching heard it pretty clearly. I thought that was very, very moving, actually.
I mean, what Cuba is doing right now is what they do in every, international crisis, whether it's hurricane relief or earthquake relief or just other pandemics in the past. They are on the front lines, and they are on the front lines with international solidarity, and that is why they do it. Whether it be taking cruise ships that the U.S. is refusing to dock, promoting their antiviral medication essentially for free to other countries around the world to use, or exporting leagues of doctors into these hotspots to fight COVID. And it's absolutely heartwarming. Again, going back to what the U.S. does, I mean, they have to delegitimize these efforts. I mean, a lot of news is reporting on this, fairly, because it's kind of hard not to, because the Cuban doctors are everywhere. But the U.S. State Department, I'm sure you've talked about, has issued that statement essentially just saying, do not accept their help. It's like, well,
yeah, right.
But I think this whole thing, to end on a positive note, Michael, is that the global pandemic, not only is it kind of uniquely comforting that the entire world is in this together, and it really brings to light how we are one global family. All of us are sisters and brothers fighting the same fight right now. But it exposes the contradictions and hypocrisy of the current world order, which puts the U.S. in a position as this moral and just arbiter of everything, and who can dictate who gets to live and who gets to die. And the utter abysmal failures of the U.S. empire to not only provide for its citizens, but also to advance unconscionably imperialism and hegemony during a time of global struggle is just exposing its rot more and more. And I think that this is a radicalizing moment and a revolutionizing moment for not only Americans, but the world. And all of these strikes that are impending here, I think, is a really incredible avenue that we can hopefully regenerate a massive labor struggle and mount grassroots pressure to resurrect not only labor in this country, but also an anti-war movement that we can link together with why all of our resources are siphoned for this perpetual death and war machine abroad. And Bernie's proposals have never seemed more obvious and just absurdly apparent that we need to employ immediately. But I think that this is a moment that we can use to our advantage to radicalize each other. And as you said, not social distancing, but we need to be socially involved, engaged, and enlightening each other and continuing that grassroots political consciousness campaign, because this is all we have at this point. And hopefully we can emerge out of this with a new consciousness. And there is no turning back to the old age. It's moving on from here. And it's just a matter of what world are we going to enter into.
Exactly. Abby Martin, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Check out all of Abby's incredible work at the Empire Files and more. Abby, thanks a million.
Thank you so much. Rock on. Stay safe.
Take care. You guys back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Matt and David. And I think we're back just in time to get David going actually on the gym.
Yeah, let's do it. I want to take a second. Obviously, there's one story. There's one reality that we're living right now, which is this, economic, calamity and the stress of wondering what's going to happen next. And I don't think there's any real way to talk about the COVID crisis, the coronavirus crisis, what I'm calling COVID capitalism, without first sort of setting the table to why we're really in this situation in the United States. Our healthcare system is obviously really unresponsive to any kind of national planning. It's also incredibly unequal. And the private market, the for-profit system of healthcare really, really weakens the United States. For example, and I think I've talked about this a couple of times, but I just really want to hit home, hospitals are a huge issue in the US. Under a for-profit model, hospitals tend to want to do procedures that are very profitable. So that's why you see, like, for example, Boston is a city that actually has a significant amount of hospitals, especially around the wealthier areas of the city. And they specialize in things like, heart surgeries and more complicated, more expensive surgeries. For a situation like coronavirus, when you basically, you need to have the facilities to hold a lot of people, to keep them safe and to provide them with, emergency care, these hospital systems are not equipped for that. And then at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, in rural America, in the South, in poor communities that use Medicaid, for example, as their primary health insurance for the area, those hospitals are massively underfunded, have been closing at drastic and very dangerous rate. So we see the healthcare system, the for-profit model, is not equipped for this. Two, the inability for any kind of economic planning that we have in this country makes us incredibly weak in a moment like this. And, what has been the response since the '08 crisis? It has been a way to it's been a strategy that's been all about trying to prop up the markets, prop up asset prices without doing any kind of fundamental reforms in the economy. And that's also not just limited to 2008 to 2020. That's been basically since the 1970s that capitalism went into crisis, and it's never been able to work its way out. It's been constantly trying to find financial tricks and basically exploitation of new markets, but it's never been able to get over the kind of structural growth issues that it has. The reason I bring that up is there's a very good article in Tribune magazine by James Meadway, where he was sort of rebuking the idea that people have been saying, well, this is a war economy moment. This is like a war economy like we had during World War II. It's actually the opposite of a war economy, because in a war economy, you actually are trying to stimulate the economy and have a lot more activity and more production. Well, in this crisis, we're actually trying to do the opposite. We're trying to demobilize the economy. We're trying to make there be less unnecessary economic activity, basically people who are working in jobs that are not necessarily, I won't say non-essential, but they're not the kind of thing that if they don't happen this week, then the entire system will collapse, right? We actually need to be getting as many people at home as possible. So how do you have an economic stimulus that deals with that, that issue? It becomes a lot more complicated, especially in the political economic dynamic that we have today. And that's what I want to get at. Who eats first under the stimulus bill? And I think it's very telling for the way that our economy works in tandem with government. So, there's been the stimulus in the United States, and there's also been stimulus in the United Kingdom. But fundamentally, the people who are eating first, people who the bill is coming at first, are businesses. And a lot of the aid that's going to people is being mediated through business. So the idea is that if you prop up the businesses and you prop up the employers, that they can potentially give some benefits to their employees to maintain them for when the crisis is over. And this is a really important distinction, because one of the fundamental fears of the Republicans, the conservative government, and also a lot of the Democrats has been that a kind of stimulus that basically keeps people's needs met during this crisis, right? Which any kind of humane, rational society would be able to do. But obviously in the United States and the United Kingdom, we do not live in those kind of societies. We live in cruel societies that are put profit first. And by the way, profit of the few first over the many. Right. So in the United States, they want that economic stimulus to be going to your employer so that you have to rely on them for sick pay, for your insurance, for the possibility of retaining a paycheck. And the direct money that's going to people was a paltry amount. It's not enough that people are going to be able to sustain themselves on. It also doesn't give them any kind of security going forward. It's actually doing the exact opposite of what we should be doing in this moment, which is commodities that aren't necessarily like immediate needs for society, pursuing those kind of activities because they're afraid if they don't do that kind of work, they won't be able to eat, they won't be able to have a roof over their head. Capitalism and the capitalist system, let me just say this real quick, because I think people get this mixed up a lot when we talk about the government and its relationship to the capitalist class. The government understands uh, the long-term interests of the bourgeoisie. They are looking out for the people on top of the society in the long term, not always their immediate reactions and their immediate interests. They understand that they need to maintain this dynamic where workers who produce the value in the society continue to see themselves as weak and almost unnecessary in this kind of precarious situation. Right, that is what the government is trying to do right now with this stimulus bill. They're trying to maintain a system that keeps the people who produce the value in our society obscured from the reality of their own worth and their own importance in the society. Now, obviously, that's starting to be demystified as you see Amazon workers are recognizing how crucial they are to the society. Frontline workers at grocery stores are realizing how crucial they are to the society. But at the same time, capital is doing as much as it can to try to obscure that relationship. So we're seeing the way that COVID capitalism is working is it's trying to, in a very unnatural and in a very reckless and dangerous way, maintain that fundamental relationship of power, make sure that that is able to survive this. And they fundamentally, they don't care about what the human cost of maintaining that relationship is. It's really encouraging that gig workers are fighting back, that frontline workers are fighting back, and that's the kind of thing that we're going to need to continue to mobilize and maintain going forward. But there's a frightening moment, there's a frightening reality and potential here, where capitalism is actually able to come out of this crisis very strong in a way that actually keeps a significant amount of the population socially isolated, continue this kind of like pod living, right?
Right.
And then keep an underclass that is constantly exposed to workplace endangerment, to overwork, and to not basically having the kind of resources that they need to have a happy, fulfilling, hell, even a safe life, right? And there's a potential that this kind of crisis capitalism actually merges into something more permanent, and we need to be very aware and prepared for that potential, because any kind of fantasy that some kind of crisis would actually come and bring us together, any kind of crisis would come and would rectify these situations, that Republicans one day would wake up and realize, this is not a correct or just or moral way to live, have been proven absolutely wrong. We need to prepare for the worst. And we have the encouraging thing about that, though, is that we have the fundamental power in the society. The fundamental trick of capitalism is that capitalism is reliant on the working class and on working people. And they've done a lot of work to try to make that idea seem foreign to us. But this kind of crisis makes it actually very clear that that is the fundamental relationship in society. And we need to build off of that if we want to get out of this with any hope of a better future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, I think it's very clear that on a political level that this is a moment of consolidation. It is incredibly dangerous. It is, and I think that split is very important. There's the hyper wealth, just totally unparalleled in history, even of the robber baron era, a type of wealth generated, to say just even on a personal level, like the just innate danger of the Jeff Bezos, Bill Gateses of the world. Mm-hmm. There's sort of in other ways, with the obvious vast massive differences, there's kind of like a 10-15% top of the economy. Mm-hmm. Those people are still subject to the enormous danger of how we do capitalism, but they are, relatively speaking, a lot more insulated, and they get to, quote unquote, enjoy some of the fruits. Mm-hmm. And then, there's this vast, both unemployed, surplus labor population, always there to keep wages down and threaten to break strikes and so on. And then just an increasingly, what we call the service economy. And this bailout and this approach is locking that in, and even getting rid of, I think, areas that we need to, again, have a more nuanced perspective about, but like just even seeing like some of the circuit breakers of small businesses as an example, mm-hmm. not as like an endpoint, but look, totally fine areas that are at least breaking up the pure concentration of capital, which we're radically taking we're hurtling towards the next steps towards, and that was already the case.
And then that dynamic too, who eats first, the big business over the small business, right? We're still waiting for like the big plan there. And I just wanted to add one relationship that I didn't hit on. This is the same kind of relationship as the employer, the renters to the landlord. Right,
this is important.
You get a mortgage freeze, right? You get a break on the mortgage, but the people who are renting, the idea is that, well, maybe your landlord will trickle that down to you, right? They want to maintain that kind of exploitative relationship fundamentally between the renter to the landlord, right? They don't want to go directly to the people, and that's because they fundamentally, these people are smart. They understand that capitalism is a power relationship, and they want to maintain that power relationship skewed as much as possible to those with money and those with power.
That's it. All right, folks. Are we going to get to Liz Francic? Yeah, let's take like a 30-second break. That's cool. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is the illustrious Liz Francic. She's the co-host of the True Anon podcast, and she resents being called a boomer. Liz, how you doing?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Hanging in.
Yeah.
How are things there?
I think they're okay. I don't know. I mean, I actually think the situation in San Francisco with the homeless is pretty serious. And the mayor is like not doing anything. And I don't know like what is going to happen with that.
Yeah. I think we have a homelessness situation here, a Rikers situation.
Yeah.
And then I barely even can talk about this, but it is fucking incredible watching people get so excited about Cuomo when he isn't even doing a good job.
It's the most insane thing I've ever heard.
He's not even doing a good job at this.
No. And in fact, it's it makes more sense to me that people would like what Newsom was doing because he's being him and Inslee are being really, although Inslee didn't really shut down the state, but they're being really proactive. But I would never degrade myself to stan Newsom. That's totally disgusting. But Cuomo is another level of he's not doing, the only thing he's doing is going on TV. And his stupid PowerPoint presentations are always hug your family, everyone's gonna die, don't cry, say your final rites. It's why is this is not good. This is not, he's got nipple piercings on TV. Did you see that?
Do we believe that? Do you buy the nipple piercing conspiracy? Break it down.
I'm going to say if it's not a piercing, he should go see a doctor because that situation is not, there's something wrong there.
Liz, he should not see a doctor right now. We're at overcapacity.
Well, that's true. Although
can't hang out with his fucking
brother
breasts.
Has it.
Do we have this picture? Yeah, that's his brother does have it. That is actually, is it an equalizer that Boris Johnson and Cuomo's brother have it? Or is it the same way it started a couple weeks ago where you just be an assistant actor on Baywatch knows that they have it. I guess that's nice.
I don't know. I mean, Bolsonaro for sure has it.
Oh,
and
definitely.
Lying.
Yes.
Yeah, what that is okay.
Wow.
That's a barbell.
You know what? I haven't really seen that before. He does have a nipple ring.
That's
a guy with.
Oh my god.
That's a guy with a Doors poster in his fucking man.
No. Wait, did you watch Tiger King?
No, not yet. Should I see it?
So good.
Yeah,
Does it hold
good.
Up?
It's fun. But I was gonna say, and this will make sense to the people watching that have seen it. He seems like someone who's into the same kind of weird, creepy sex shit as Tiger King cast.
Did you see? You saw that Cuomo has his house in Westchester's up for sale, and there's this picture of it's I don't know, some type of living quarters, and he's got his treadmills and he's got his TV, and then it's he's got this giant poster of Jim Morrison, and it's just of course, of course.
Yeah, he's oof. I find him so disgust. Like, not even getting into the politics, which is like, you know, you barely even want to. It's like, yeah, he's not taking federal money because he can't take it because he wants to cut Medicare in a fucking pandemic.
In a fucking pandemic.
But it's like this.
Yeah,
I mean, he's a fucking monster. I think that I was thinking about this, and if Bolsonaro and Bojo recover, then there's a cure, and they're keeping it from the people.
Ooh, I love this.
Because they said that
Bolsonaro.
They said that Prince Charles had it, and they said that he quarantined himself, which I imagine is quite easy in the palace or wherever he is, for 7 days, and that he was fine after 7 days. That is not the normal period of time for the recovery period. And the Brits, look, I hate saying this because my grandmother was British, so, you know, I'm sorry to my family, but like, this is not good genetic stock. You know what I mean? And like particularly the royal family, they've been inbreeding for generations. That is not a good immune system that they're working with. It's already compromised from, you know, centuries of, you know, horrific Habsburgian, you know, activities. So I just refuse to believe that if Prince Charles had it in the first place, then there's a cure, because I don't know how he recovered.
Definitely Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is, I mean,
he totally looks like shit.
Bolsonaro is absolutely like, even if that knife attack was staged, that's still much for him. Like, he is
I forgot about
bad shape. Have you read so there's this really, I don't, you know, some people get like he goes too far for some people, but there's this really, really brilliant guy who like everybody should read one way or another, Pepe Escobar. He writes for Asia Times. Read he's got a new column on the French and the it's very in your lane, Liz. I'd look it up.
Really? Okay. Interesting.
It is interesting. He's also totally like on the he's very interested in like the Chinese narrative of where this came from. But I want to read you a little bit of a quote, because like I think that the way you talk about conspiracy theories, or whatever we're calling them now, is significant, because like a lot of us, I think, kind of grew up sort of coming of age politically and realizing like actually like there's a lot of bullshit in conspiracy culture. It can take us down like really bad paths, like you're talking about something real and then all of a sudden like you're in some type of like anti-Semitic theory. And there also can be like super disempowering, because if you think like the whole world is just like mapped out and preordained and like there's no human agency. But now I feel like we've gotten, especially in like liberal discourse, and what's fun about your show is like people have gotten like, oh, well, that's a conspiracy. And it's like, right, there's conspiracy thinking like Alex Jones, and then it's like, are we actually saying that conspiracies don't exist? Because like human beings are conspiring like every second, like every institutional level. And I just want to, I'm going to read you really quickly. I'm going to truncate this quote from this guy, Danny Roddy, which I think is kind of interesting. He's like, similarly, skeptics that doubt the official narrative behind widely televised tragedy might find motivation in the fact that his government is constantly lying to him. Instead of victim blaming people for quote unquote wrong ideas, it might be more productive to build new systems to reduce imposed systems that tend to make everyone sick while stifling human potential. And of course, I'd call that imposed system capitalism. But what do you think about that kind of like framework around conspiracy theories? Do you buy it?
Yeah, you know, I think a friend of mine said once that, you know, once something is called a conspiracy theory, it loses its value, maybe. And it's like, once it's sort of like slotted into like what you're talking about, how we think about these things, like, you know, you say Alex Jones or just like general quackery, or that there is a kind of like, you know, demobilizing quality to it, where it feels like suddenly everything's out of your hands because everything is being controlled, like what you're talking about. And so once you kind of like, he was saying that like once it's sort of like rhetorically in that mode, it has lost its political content. And I wonder if there's like maybe this is what we're doing with the podcast. I don't know. I don't even know what we're doing with the podcast now anymore. We're figuring it out still. But you know, maybe it's a way to like rescue some of these things from that dustbin where people put things and say like, hey, wait a second, like actually there is political content here that we need to struggle with, and there is something important to map out here. Not like you know, like you say, like you don't have to put a tinfoil hat on to understand the way that power moves the various state and capital institutions. I mean, and you can't, because you do have to understand that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. So like I feel like a concrete example of that I've been thinking a lot about is just like our role, even like what you and I do on computers, using these platforms that are owned by a handful of companies that have, you know, the best surveillance system to human history, that we not only tracks us, like we happily participate in. Like we use the phone that like tracks our temperature to see what, you know, what we might be doing while we're holding the thing, right? And then like how to like incent. So like that to me is a really interesting discourse, especially right now, because it's like, okay, so we're all quarantined, or a lot of, I mean, if you're privileged enough to be quarantined, like if you're in a certain part of the economic ladder or of, you know, in medicine, you're not. But if you have the ability to be quarantined and actually like still do your work, we're using these communication technologies and platforms, and all the time anyways, but now it's like even more reinforced because we can't even say like we were talking recently about how like, you know, when people would be like trash on Twitter or something, and then like and if they got criticized for being an asshole, they'd be like, oh, it's just online, like whatever. Now it's like, well, this is like where we are. What is what's a good way to think about like our relationship with having these conversations on platforms, getting these ideas put forward on platforms that are like, and I like this a lot about your show, it's like these platforms are not neutral and they are fundamentally not on our terrain. So it's not even a question of just like, oh, well, I'm going to use that well. Sure, use that well. Let's go for it. That's awesome. We should. But the context in which we're on these things goes to really concentrated capital and surveillance and intelligence systems. And we need to like grapple with that.
Yeah, but at the same time, like everything we do does.
Yeah.
And I think that I mean, I guess this is like a lot of stuff that I you know, I think there's this like idea that we can just build our own. I mean, I don't know. This gets into maybe probably some of the problems that I have with anarchism, right? Which is like this idea that we can just like build state organs that can I mean, because that's at this point, that's what we're talking about, because you're talking about basically a media apparatus, you
right.
know? Mm-hmm. And we don't really have, I mean, I guess you can do like some of that on the internet, but even the internet is its own institution that's completely embedded with these same sort of compromised state, capital, techno, surveillance, etc. You know, institutions that you're grappling with. So at a certain point, I think, I mean, we did a really long interview with Yasha Levine.
Yep. And
we were talking about, and he's great. And
it's a good book.
Yeah, he has a very different take on a lot of the surveillance stuff than I think a lot of traditional Americans, because I think whether we know it or not, there is a very like libertarian bent like embedded in the American soul, like even as much as you resist it, which is quite different from, you know, obviously Yasha's Russian. And there's this sort of sense of like, well, if the government can see and surveil and do everything, then that's the number one priority. We have to get rid of that first. Otherwise we can't do anything. And it's like, well, at some point it almost becomes an excuse for you to not to do anything. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I almost wonder if it's like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not excusing, at this point in my mind, the way that I conceive of like the surveillance state is so vast, but also it's so bureaucratized, and the stuff that they're not combing through everything. They're just sweeping everything up. And at this point, what they're doing with it is to sell, skinny tea on Instagram. Like, it's not even, do you know what I mean? It's almost totally pathetic. It's so pathetically American that we would use these like sort of like horrific dystopian sci-fi surveillance powers to sell like Casper mattress. It's like, Americans, we're so small-minded, even in our, anyway, but
even in our evil.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we aren't, but you know what I'm saying.
I do.
I don't know. I wonder.
So do you think that's interesting? Because then that's like another challenge right now of like, actually, this also goes back to internet discourse, because especially, I mean, now like there isn't like the same utopian story that gets told around the internet.
Yeah, that has totally broken down.
That's really broken down. But the early utopian stories of the internet was all along like, the kind of traditional libertarian, but definitely also anarchist lens. And like, I agree. Like, I agree with you about a lot of the critiques of anarchism. And I think that a lot of it can be kind of fantasy based and myopic. And then at the same time, it's like, especially now, it's like, there's no understanding or strategy for state power there. But then there's also like, right, but what the fuck is it? Like, there at the same time, at least there's like the advantage of having some frameworks like mutual aid or whatever, which maybe are like accessible in a certain way now, versus like, oh no, what we need is like a vanguard party, right? I'm like, oh, okay. Like that becomes like its next fantasy life. I think maybe that's what it is. It's like, forget about like trying to be pure or not work with things as they are, because that's impossible and it's not useful to think that way. But at the same time, like, what is a way that thinks about like how to take this stuff on that isn't like magical thinking, basically?
I mean, that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it has to do like, I mean, I think that this moment that we're in, and like we're at what's basically, the tail end of what felt like possibly a little moment with Corbyn and Bernie, right? Yep. And that's gone.
Yeah.
And now we've got this once in a century, once in a generation fucking pandemic, which everything is up in the air now in terms of, I mean, that's what we keep saying on the podcast. It's like history is back in motion, which is, exciting, but equally terrifying, and I think it's gonna, it's tough because I think that in the United States, we don't really know how things are going to shake out. And that is going to determine what left politics is going to look like, as we move forward through the next decade or so. I don't really know. Like, and I'm saying that because it's like, when you look at the scope of this crisis that we're in, like, I don't even think anyone's really even talking about it enough as a crisis. Like, this is a fucking crisis.
Yeah.
Like we're looking at like 30-40% unemployment. This is unprecedented in fucking history. Like, so, that's what I mean by when I'm saying we don't know how things are going to shake out. What I do think is what we're seeing, and I think this is true historically, but people always forget, is that workers are always ahead of organizers, right? Yep. And so you're seeing workers already who, essential workers, it's so funny that they're essential, but of course that means, they're paid pennies, walking out, making demands, calling for more strikes and more mobilizations. You're seeing it at Amazon, and these are important places to attack right now. And that's very exciting for, these people. And I think what's I don't know. I was thinking about this, and it's not good in a situation where it's like, these people are risking, these workers are risking their lives also to demand better. And I think we've forgotten that it takes that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we've forgotten that, like, yeah, it takes risking your life, and that's really fucking scary. And I don't know, things just feel to me to be shifting, very quickly, and out of a kind of, back into like a very real place, a real political place.
There's this
I don't know.
No, there's this book I read a couple of months ago by Bruno Latour, and it's a cool book, but the title is like what stuck with me most. It was just called Down to Earth. And it was literally the idea of like the eco crisis. In this case, he was talking the book is focused on that, but it could apply to this, is like, we're in a collective fantasy life. Like limitless growth is a fantasy. And we are going to start getting shocks to the system in terms of like real physical things that will literally take us back down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I really think that's going to happen. Like, I mean, look, I was at the grocery store the other day. They don't have any eggs.
Right.
There's no eggs in my neighborhood. So that's just what it is. And that's a small thing. That's not a big deal, whatever. But what I mean is we're going to see massive supply chain shocks. We're going to see, I'm sorry to say this because you're in New York, but it's like, I don't know what the situation in New York is going to be like in a month, let alone 6, And there's other places in the country that are going to face similar situations, unfortunately. So it's like almost like, I don't know. I think there's like, I think people really need to stay vigilant about all the shifts that are happening and get themselves in kind of a mindset of like, okay, like things are not going back to any kind of normal in the way that we previously thought. Things would just kind of continue on in some way,
What is that mindset to you? Like because it's like intellectually, it's like, I could see like the coping mechanism of like, all right, like it's going to be a couple of weeks and then, all right, it's going to be a couple of months and then, right. Like I get that, but there's also like, we talk about like the mindsets or what is sort of emotionally required even now. And I don't know, like, what does that actually look like or how to cultivate that, like, because I also think that people will, particularly when you're under pressure, mostly you go back to like your comfort zones to the extent that that's like humanly possible right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's tough. I mean, I don't know. I think it's like, I mean, I struggle with it. It's not like I don't have the answers. Like, there are some days where I'm like having a really hard time. I don't know. It's I don't know. I don't have any good answers. I think it's just like really like, I think one of the hardest tasks is and this is kind of what you were talking about using all these platforms and these kind of screens that are now mediating, is that it's like, it's no secret that we're increasingly alienated from one another over the, and that was sort of like growing exponentially over the past, 8-9 years, ever since, basically the big tech revolution, 10 years, whatever. But now that stuff is like, it was invisible before, and now it's very visible and present. And you're like, oh no, we really are. It's like we're seeing physical manifestation of like what was already kind of always present but hidden from our, out of plain view, whatever.
Yeah.
It's like Brace said the other day, and I think it's totally true. It's like everyone's an incel now. It's like the great incelification. And there's something to that where we have to like dig into ourselves and become really creative about how we're going to connect with other people And if we don't, we're not going to make it through. And now we have to do it in like these new and novel ways using technology that most of us fucking hate.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's kind of like a weird, it's a weird headspace to get into. I don't begrudge people for like having a hard time with it.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, that also, I mean, my kick now, and another thing like that people on the left sometimes really don't like, is like, there has to be a spiritual component to this. Now, like how people define that and what that means to them, and I don't even care. And I get all of the critiques of fundamentalism and New Ageism and whatever, but there is something in certain like practices or ideas that do actually correlate with, you need to like expand the connective tissue of your empathy. You need to like maybe also have like a better relationship with your own physiology as we get more virtual. And that like there are ways of cultivating that, which and because it seems to me like that is going to be part of that digging that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's like, it takes a lot of discipline to manage this. And that's something that I think as Americans, and particularly, as everyone likes to say about millennials, a lot of people lack especially young people lack self-discipline. And like, that's not really, it's not really part of our culture in a way that I think it is in other places. And cultivating that on one's own is, it takes a lot of work. It's important though. And it's also important, I think, for left politics. I mean, I would love to see a lot more discipline on the left. So perhaps it could be useful in that way, moving forward. But I think that, and that means creating a routine and connecting with people and not, I mean, it all kind of goes into it. Otherwise, you're going to go insane, and you're just not going to be useful for other people, and they're not going to be useful for you. Like, you know what I mean? It's all these two-way streets that you have to figure out.
Yeah, but I think that that's really brilliant right there too. Like in especially in a US context, we have this allergy because like the rhetoric of self-responsibility has been used by, basically neoliberal and capitalist discourses to punish the poor and discipline people and all of this. We know all of that, right? But then at the same time, like there is literally a reality that like interdependence is a two-way street, and what you bring into a group as an individual matters, and then what the group feeds back to individuals matter. Like it's a dynamic reciprocal process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just like even actually having the capacity to say, we need to talk about something like self-discipline, not in the way that we've already rejected and we've already talked about, and that's totally fine. We can have that critique, but that we can't just be triggered by that terminology. And we also have to see the objective and extraordinary like truth of that. Like discipline matters, self matters. That's the strength of your own like organism you're going to bring to a collective effort.
Right. Well, you and I have always talked, I've talked previously about, that, dissenting discourse, or it's not, I'm hoping that a lot of that stuff breaks down during all of this, which I feel like I was talking to some other people about that. And I think that like left spaces, however we want to call that, I hate that word space.
I don't like the word space, and I want to take a break from bodies.
No, but I think, and yeah, we've talked about this, that it's been increasingly up until now, it feels very difficult for dissenting opinions to not even just like take flight, but like be allowed.
Right.
And everyone, we know Vampire's Castle, whatever, we don't have to say that stuff again, but it's, if it really does feel like all of this stuff is laying bare how meaningless a lot of those, like how trivial a lot of the like, interleft petty fighting has been. It's like none of this stuff matters. I don't know. You know?
No, 100%. 100. I mean, it doesn't matter. And then it's like even beyond that, like what are we? I mean, I've said that in terms of it not mattering, in terms of thinking about like what is actually appealing to a broad set of people, all of that still stands. And then there's also like the immediacy right now of like, what are we being called to do by circumstances? And I think that does take like a very different and really challenging level of introspection, for sure, and discipline too, because I mean, it's like even, you know, it's discipline even in like a small way to not be like personally reckless right now, right? Like I don't want to deal with this. What the fuck? I'm gonna go take a run. Like, you know, I mean, you can take a run, but you know my point. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to deal with this shit.
I know. I saw photos of New Yorkers. They were all like lining up on the West Side Highway to take a look at the fucking ship. It's like, bro, what are you doing? What is everyone doing? Get inside, man.
Well, that's right. That's like the other, like, I am really worried about, and I've talked about like really specifically, like I think the Bill Barr DOJ rules he's trying to push through, those are fucking terrifying. And regardless of any kind of like internal sentiment about libertarianism or not, though, like pretrial detention without habeas corpus is a problem, period. That threatens, right? Like that is serious shit. And then on the other hand, so I look at that and a part of me has this like allergy to the heavy hands. And then like, yeah, you look at New York and you're like, how the fuck did they not just say, yo, you need to be inside for 2 weeks? Like people are like still, I saw a video the other day of, I think it's called buildering. Have you seen, it's the most obnoxious. It's like, instead of bouldering, people like climb brownstones. And it's like this guy who looks like a 2008 Williamsburg hipster who's like never upgraded his wardrobe since then, like literally climbing on a building. And the guy who's filming him is like, he's going to get corona.
Jesus Christ.
It's like, where's the discipline? maybe this is my inner Leninist shit I'm revealing here now.
I mean, yeah, don't get me started. But I just, you know, yeah, I think, I mean, some of it is the way that they've rolled everything out. I mean, Cuomo really fucked up, and it's wild that they just like, the media doesn't care, and they're just going like full, you know, I love you, Daddy Mueller on him, which is so weird. I mean, I don't know why. I literally don't know why, because he like really fucked up the situation in New York by not shutting the city down. And it's like, yeah, these people weren't going to, look, that's the thing. They weren't going to shut down Broadway until there was a gun to their head. It's too much money. And that's what they care about, you know? And now like hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. It's like, sorry, it just makes me speechless, this whole thing. Sorry, I had to bring it to such a dark place.
I mean, we have to be with what is. I'm going to ask you a sort of trivial question before we're done, but I think it will be entertaining for people because that also matters. If somebody tells you that they think that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide, what does that tell you about them? And what do you think their astrological sign is?
Their astrological sign?
Yeah.
Well, I will say that there was that poll that said a lot of Elizabeth Warren voters agreed that he committed suicide. So I'm not
Are you serious?
I'm not saying that correlation is causation, but I think like I think that if you have, I've met people that either don't have an opinion or like, oh yeah, that's crazy, but they like, you know what I mean? Like they haven't, but I think if you've looked into it and you've decided he killed himself, you're either a contrarian, which I always get accused of, but which is not true, or dumb noodle brain. Like, I don't know what to tell you. You probably like just eat up the MSNBC slop with everyone else, in my opinion.
All right. So, and what might your sign?
Astrological sign. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say Virgo.
Ooh, Virgos are put on notice. I think Nas is a Virgo, though.
I don't have a thing against Virgo. I'm just trying to think of a person, like what kind of personality would come to that conclusion. Maybe.
Do you think it's
Gemini?
Maybe oh yeah, total Gemini shit. Do you think that that's all true? But do you that is like an emotional barrier for, because this is another thing I've been trying to think about. The last thing I want to ask you about that's like serious about this is not that I think, like, obviously the whole like campaign of trying to like we've had this conversation so many times, it's exhausting, but like, yes, trying to build an alliance with like the professional managerial class and assuage all these liberal anxieties is ultimately not a winning strategy for like a socialist project, blah 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 blah. But even before we get to all of that, I feel like sometimes when you talk to people who are frequently boomers like you, Liz, who they actually get all of this stuff. Like they might dig Bernie, they might like it all the other garbage doesn't come along with it. But like that step of Jeffrey Epstein, there was like a hit taken out on him that like implicates somebody that maybe I know about or have read like a fawning profile of. For them to go there is like, it's just like, whoa, I can take every dose short of that. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, like it's emotional, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think you saw the same thing with JFK.
Yeah. like
I think it's really hard. I think people can be like, yeah, it's like you can both, people are complicated, which people like to, like to think that humans are like easily reductive, or like you can just, reduce people really easily. But like, I think a lot of people can hold at the same time that the magic bullet theory is bullshit and we don't totally know everything that happened. But also to say out loud, the US government assassinated its own president is like too far.
Right.
You know what I mean? And it's like those two things are really close together in a kind of like continuum of where one idea would lead to the next. But it's like, and I don't blame people, because in order to really internalize that, you have to then, look, if you have faith, most Americans do, because our state is functioning. It wouldn't be functioning if Americans didn't have faith in their own state.
Right.
But they have faith in the institutions of the state, then it would completely shatter everything. It's almost an impossible leap, which is why it's, I think, very limited in its kind of political content, perhaps. Because it's like, it's almost too psychologically damaging in order to be a mass kind of, I don't know, moment maybe.
Yeah, and then when people turn it into like a linear, like Illuminati, whatever, you sort of skip that too, actually. Because in a way, like, you ever talk to people who have like a very linear conspiracy view of the world, and you're like, wow, like in a funny way, you think that the United States government operates with just like a shocking level of efficiency and strategy. Like they never make mistakes. Yeah.
That's the thing that really gets me, is that I think it's, and this is again something we kind of talk about on the podcast, is like, there's a bit of an overestimation sometimes of the state capacity. And I think Zizek's piece and recent piece in RT kind of got into this, but there's like the thing that like, you see all these people warning about like martial law and, all these crazy ways that we're headed down. And I have myself like some doomer thoughts about, possibilities there. But like most of what it's betraying is actually a desire for that. Because the capacity of the state to like enact China style, like a shutdown of that, like we don't have that. Like, I don't think that we literally lack the critical infrastructure to do a nationwide, even a statewide lockdown. And I don't even know if, I mean, legally you can kind of do anything because it's like, who's going to sue? But it's like, it's probably unconstitutional to shut state borders. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and just to really underline, I think like thinking about this in a really balanced way, the DOJ rules that Barr is putting forward are real. They're there, and it's a serious threat and it's a serious thing. And then on the flip side, when it comes to those more doomer thoughts, Donald Trump, he floated the quarantine thing and then just totally dropped it. And then the primary thing that he's done, I really cracked myself up because last week I had like the most heavy martial law, like, totally dilute, like, we're all the podcasters, we're all going to go to Guantanamo. Like, just total, like, we're going. Like, I call Trump fat. That's it. We're fucked, right? And then he gets out on TV and it's like, not only is it not like the troops are on the streets, it's like a deeper fantasy than any of us. Like, can we please just get back to work? My reelection might be might be threatened. It's like, I'm going to actually, the most reckless market tyrannical thing I can do is just like sacrifice people to death by trying to skip this and just getting back to it. And that's actually the pathology in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think when he was saying that market stuff, he was saying that we were all getting back to work just to juice the market. I don't think anyone thinks that anyone's going back to work anytime soon, except for, of course, the essential workers. I love how I keep pointing towards my grocery store. I don't know why. I'm sorry.
It's important.
But I do think that, like, what's scary is people realizing that we don't have that state capacity and like there isn't an authority coming. And that's part of like getting in that mentality that we were talking about earlier, right? It's like there isn't an authority to appeal to right now. And I don't mean that in like a prepper, like everyone go crazy, we're all on our own. I mean the exact opposite of that. But it's like, this is putting like right, like in your face, a lot of realities about the state of America that we need to like grapple with, like there won't be tanks in the street for a lot of reasons, but like mostly because, we don't lack the infrastructure to handle that.
We literally couldn't have tanks on the street. Like, just to be,
no,
Trump
I know we
wanted that. No, I mean, I just want to, no, I know you do. I want to spell that out for people when you say that. Like, he went to France and he was like, that's amazing. They're having tanks on the street. I want that. And then like the liberals freaked out because it's totally authoritarian to want that. And then it didn't happen because they were just like, we can't do that. The streets of DC will collapse.
Yeah. Like we don't, maybe his infrastructure bill will fix that, but.
Right, exactly. Well, Liz Francic, I really appreciate your time as always. Please stay safe. Please stay, doing what you do. And I'm sure we'll talk soon. And seriously, I appreciate it. Everybody check out TrueAnon.
Thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. All right, folks. Matt and David, are you there? Liz is going to take a second.
Yeah.
You got it? Everybody is just okay. Boomer. I was playing. They have a Twitch feed. All right, guys, we're gonna go to the post game shortly. We've got Ben Burgess and Joshua Kahn coming on. We've got a bunch of stories to get to. We've got some Pepe Mojica to play. We've got a bunch of bonus content for patrons and everybody else coming out this week. So as I say, this is definitely the time, if you can, to patron up, patreon.com/TMBS. And also it is the time, if you need any sort of deal, to let us know. And and we're just going to keep going. We're going to just keep grinding this content out. It's weird. I feel like simultaneously what we're doing is actually extremely important, and it's also, on the other hand, just like totally ephemeral. Like that's the that's the kind of paradox that I feel like we're living in. But
let's just be thankful we can do it for as long as we can.
Seriously. Thank you guys. I appreciate you guys, everybody on the team, obviously, and I appreciate each and every one of you. And join us. We'll see you in the post game. Thanks, everybody.